Understanding our past connects us to the present, and Mohai is committed to exploring the full complexity of history. And we're going to be digging into even more of that complexity tonight, learning about the Chinese Exclusion Act files. So I'd like to introduce our two presenters. First of all, we have Trish Hackett Nicola, who is a family historian and historical researcher who volunteers at the National Archives in Seattle and has worked on the Chinese Exclusion Act files for over 17 years. So we're going to be hearing about the wide variety of family information and photos found in these case files. Trish also has a blog, the Chinese Exclusion Act Files.org, .com, I'm sorry, I knew I was going to mess that up. Chinese Exclusion Act Files.com, which she'll tell you more about. It's ChineseExclusionFiles.com, which she will tell you more about as well. Our second presenter is Cathy Lee, who was practically born in Seattle, immigrated from Taiwan at age 1. She works at Boeing, both like her father and brother before her, is active in the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, both locally and nationally, and hosts college students through UW's Foundation of International Understanding through Students. So very excited to welcome both of them. Let's give them a round of applause, and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Trish. Welcome, and thank you for coming on this beautiful evening. I've got this is, how do I do this? This is forward?
Yes, there we go.
I'm going to start by giving you some background about the Act and show you what the files look like at the National Archives. And then Cathy's going to tell you about getting her great-aunt's Exclusion Act file and using other sources to get a more complete story about her great-aunt. And then I'll show you some more stories from the files. And if you have any questions, you can ask them at the end of the presentation. The purpose of the Act was to limit the number of Chinese entering the United States and keep out laborers, and prevent the Chinese already here from becoming naturalized citizens. I can't say it. In China in the early 1880s, the population was increasing rapidly. It went from 1 million to 4 million in less than 40 years. There were natural disasters and wars, floods, earthquakes, fires, and famine, the Opium Wars, and the Boxer Rebellion. To pay for the wars and the disasters, the Chinese government imposed high taxes on the farmers who were unable to pay them and lost their lands. They couldn't find other employment. Between 1840 and 1900, 2.5 million Chinese left China for other parts of the world. And they mostly came from the Delta area, which is the red part of the map at the bottom. A small portion of them came to California during the gold rush. Most of them thought it would be a temporary move. They believed the stories about America being the gold mountain. They wanted to get rich as quickly as possible and return to their homeland. Most of the Chinese went to California. After the gold was mined out and the railroads were built, there was an economic downturn. Many of the Caucasians were unemployed, and the Chinese were blamed. The unions required union label for all products, and the Chinese weren't allowed to join the union. Employers pitted Chinese against the white workers. There was increasing violence, intimidating boycotts, physical attacks, and riots. Ironically, it was an Irish immigrant, recent immigrant, Dennis Kearney, who led the anti-Chinese movement in San Francisco. The Chinese couldn't fade into the background like the other ethnic groups. They would always look Chinese. On May 6, 1882, President Chester A. Arthur approved the Chinese Exclusion Act. The act suspended immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. The Chinese in the United States in 1880 were permitted to stay, travel abroad, and return. There was a special exemption status for merchants, teachers, students, and travelers. It was the first U.S. law to ban immigration by race or nationality. The Geary Act extended the act for 10 more years. It required certificates of residence or identity. The act was challenged in the Supreme Court but lost. It was renewed every 10 years and finally repealed 61 years later, so it was in effect from 1882 until 1943. This is a collage of samples of photos and documents that are found in the files. This is what the act meant to the Chinese. Any person of Chinese ancestry, even if born in the United States, was required to register when he took a trip out of the United States, whether it was to Canada or China, in order to prove who he was and to assure his re-entry. The burden of proof was always on the Chinese person, so he would comply with these laws just to make sure that he could get back in. This is what the files look like at the National Archives in Seattle. We have about 50,000 files on Chinese who arrived at Port Townsend, Sumas, Seattle, and Portland. The shelving units are 14 rows high. The boxes are 2 deep on each shelf, and there are 9 shelving units. Each box holds about 20 to 25 files. And at the end is what one file looks like. It usually has an application for departure, and then when the person came back, it has the arrival information, which would be the port of arrival, the date and name of the vessel, and if they were admitted, rejected, or deported. The file could include interrogations, which would include date and place of birth, witness statements, affidavits, medical exams, certificates of identity or residence, maps, and photos over a number of years, and occasionally there are birth, marriage, and death certificates. This is what an early admittance form looked like. So the act was passed in 1882, and it took them about 10 years to get up to speed. So these early forms were pretty simple, but they actually have a lot of information. It tells the ship the person came in, his name, the company he worked for, where he was living. He was in Butte, Montana, 30 years old. He was 5'6". He had no special markings, like no scars or moles, things like that. And it has the person's name who approved of his entry and where it happened. This is examples of a certificate of residence and a certificate of identity. Early on, they used the form on the left, the certificate of residence. It was just a sturdy piece of paper with a picture, and it had all the same information, name and date and a description of the person and an official who signed it. After a while, they realized that those papers weren't very easy to keep, so they made a sturdier, smaller form, and that's what's on the right. It has the same information and it has the picture, and then it has an envelope that it can be put in. And sometimes the person had to carry those around, so it was important that it was a sturdy piece of paper so they could keep it while they were working. This is an affidavit of Chin Ji-hee, who was a well-known, respected person in Seattle. His nephew was going to China, and he needed a witness to his, someone that could vouch for him and say that he was born in the United States. His nephew was born in 1880 in Eureka, Nevada, and that was before birth certificates. So there wasn't any organization that he could go to show that he really was born there. So luckily, he had this important person in Seattle who was his uncle that swore to his information. The affidavit also tells his father's name and that he was working in Butte, Montana. And when this young man went to China, he went before his paperwork was finalized. So when he came back in, he didn't have the paperwork he needed. So he was thrown into jail. And then the proper paperwork was produced, and he went to court, and Judge Hanford, who is also a well-known U.S. District Court judge who lived in Seattle, he was presiding over it, and he gave him the discharge papers. He approved of the proof that he had. So Chin Sik took these papers and he applied for his certificate of identity with those papers, and the papers remain in the file. This is an example of an interrogation. Every time someone left the country and came back in, they were interrogated. And it had the usual questions: name, age, place of birth, marital status, place of marriage. They could ask lots of different questions. But this is where you get your stories. So Chin Sik left the country 4 times between 1900 and 1915. So every time he left, he had his picture taken. They wanted to make sure that the same person was coming back. And so they'd see if he looked the same as the person that left. But the nice thing about it is you see how he's aged in 15 years. Plus you see him in the beginning, he has his traditional hairstyle, and then gradually he becomes more Americanized. He never wore the traditional Chinese clothes, probably because he was born in Nevada. This is Jim, who was 12 years old, and he arrived in Seattle in 1913. He had a medical exam, and they found out he didn't have any disease. If he had some kind of a disease, he could have been quarantined for a while until he got better. Or if he had something really bad, he could be sent back to China by himself. Now, one of the exemptions to the act was for merchants, and this is an official paper for a merchant. Let me read you the definition of a merchant. A merchant is a person engaged in buying and selling merchandise at a fixed place of business, which business is conducted in his name, and who during the time he claims to be engaged as a merchant does not engage in the performance of any manual labor, except such as necessary in the conduct of his business as a merchant. So they really didn't want laborers coming in. And it goes on to say, he shall establish by testimony of 2 credible witnesses other than Chinese the fact that he conducted such business. And it goes on and on. But this was in 1902. And this merchant paper tells us that it gives his name, his photo. He was a merchant in San Francisco. He was the manager of the Sing Fat and Company that sold Asian fancy goods and exported American produce. The company had 28 partners for a total of $70,000 interest in the firm, which is almost $2 million in today's money. The form also tells the names of all the partners and where they were living, if they were in the United States or in China, and the amount that they invested. Sometimes there were discrepancies in the interrogations because they not only did they interview the applicant, they would have to have witnesses. So there's good news and bad news about the discrepancy. If the discrepancies were, if there were a lot of them and if they were serious ones, the applicant might be deported. So it was important that everybody agree on all the information. And this applicant, there were a lot of different discrepancies, but none of them were very big. Now, the good news is if this was your ancestor, you could see a lot about his village and his life because they would ask all kinds of little questions. This one has how many homes are in the village and, you know, where did somebody go to school? Who was the neighbor married to? Just all kinds of interesting questions. Another thing that we find in the files are maps. On the left is the map of a home. It has the bedrooms, who slept where, they could ask the number of windows, where the clock was, which wall the clock was on, if they had a rice cooker, if there were any photos anywhere, how many doors, where the small door was, the direction the house was facing. And then the other one is a map of the village. And usually what they would ask were how many houses in the village, how many rows of houses, and who lived where, and was the village surrounded by bamboo, where was the pond, where were the outhouses, the cemetery, the number of steps to the well. So what they would do when someone came into the country, if they needed witnesses to prove who they were, they would put them in separate rooms and ask them to draw the maps. And then they'd compare the maps, make sure that they looked alike. This is another example of an affidavit. This is from a person who was a business person in Seattle, and he was trying to get his son to come in. This one is a little unusual because it has the picture of two sons, and usually it's just a father and a son. This application was rejected, and then an appeal was filed, and then they got the testimony of 3 additional witnesses, and everybody agreed on all the information. So, but there were 80 pages of testimony. So a lot of it is, you know, can be repetitive, but it's amazing what they would think of to ask people. So, and sometimes they would question them over and over. If they thought some things didn't agree, they would bring everybody back and ask them the same questions again. So you find out a little more detail. I mean, it was one of those things that really was very stressful and awful at the time, but if you're researching your family, you find a lot of information. This is the last page in the file. It's called the cross-reference sheet, and some files don't have any information listed there. This one is really good because it has the file numbers and the names and the relationships of all the people that were in his family that had a file. So this file gives the file numbers for the father, the wife, 6 sons, and 3 daughters. It doesn't say where those files are located, but since his file was in Seattle, you'd look in Seattle first, and then if it wasn't there, you'd go to all the other ports of entry. The act was repealed in 1943, November 1943. The U.S. and China were allies during World War II. The repeal meant that foreign-born Chinese had the right to become naturalized. Native-born Chinese no longer had to register to leave the country. Unfortunately, there was a more restrictive quota of how many Chinese could enter the U.S. It was only 105, which is pretty hard to imagine. But the Immigration Act of 1965 lifted that restriction, but essentially the Chinese were excluded for 22 more years. So finding the files, if your Chinese ancestor was in the United States before 1945, it's possible there was a file. Now, there isn't always a file. It depends on if they left the country. If they really didn't have much contact with the outside world, I guess, if they just worked quietly in their own place and didn't leave the country, there might not be a file for them. But if you're lucky enough to find a file, the way to search for it is with the person's names, and they could have lots of different variations of their name, so you have to get all the names that they had, that they used, and their port of entry, any numbers that are associated with the file. The files do have lots of different numbers. Those certificate of identity, they have a number. When they came in, every time there was correspondence, it would have a number. So if you have anything like that, and then you gather all your information and then contact an archivist at the National Archives near the port of entry. And you could, if you're not sure what the port was, you could always start with Seattle, and the archivist will help you, give you advice of what to do next. There's a lot of information on Google and Ancestry.com and books and articles. And I've been doing a blog for 4 years, and I take interesting files from the files and summarize them and put them on my blog. So it's a good way to see examples of what you can find, what documents you can find in the files. Now, Cathy Lee is going to tell you about finding her great aunt and the additional information that she found from different sources.
Thanks, Trish. Let's see. So this is Grace Chen, Chen San. She's my grandfather's oldest sister. She was an interesting woman that we heard all these stories from the family. She was very unusual for her generation. First of all, she refused to bind her feet. That was very strange from a well-bred family. Next, she insisted on going to school, a Western school, and study medicine. That was very unladylike. And good girls don't do things like that. Not only did she not marry, she traveled across the ocean, a single woman, which is unusual even for Westerners at the time. Those were the stories we heard, but we don't know details of when or where or how. When I started getting interested in finding out the story, by that time, all of my grandfather's generation were gone. And anybody in my dad's generation who was old enough to know her were gone too. A friend who studied history of missionaries in China, she told us that it would be really difficult to find any documentation in China due to the war and then subsequently the Cultural Revolution. So, armed with just a name and a birth year and a story about a postcard from Niagara Falls, I Googled and I continued to search. So here's a picture of my great-grandpa. There he is. With his number one son. He actually had 4, but there was only one in this picture, and his 3 daughters. So that's my grandpa. That's Aunt Grace, great-aunt Grace. The next one is the 5th child, Chin Ying. Great-grandma is next to her, and the youngest child, Chin Cho, is at the end. This was probably taken around the mid-1920s before Grace went abroad. So what happened? Last year I went to a talk that Trish gave, similar to this one, and I was so excited about the National Archives file, and I asked her, do you think there would be something in there about my aunt? And she said, yes, and I'll help you find it. So thank you. So she did help me find the file, and there is so much information in it and answered so many questions. So here it actually shows which school she went to in China, a women's college in Beijing. And based on that information, I was able to do some Googling and found these pictures of the school through the Yale archives. And then we see where she worked. She was a doctor in 2 different missionary hospitals, and the picture that I found was the one in Shanghai. She planned to go to New York, where she had a friend, and she had 3,000 in Mexican currency. Now, I don't know why it was Mexican, and I don't know if it was worth a lot, but that's what it said she had. And then at the bottom, it talks. It shows, when and where she was going to travel and how. So based on that travel info, we went to Ancestry.com and found the ship's manifest. And there she is. She was 32, an old maid. She was a physician by trade. She spoke both English and Chinese, which is really cool. And she landed in Seattle. Now, we always thought my family was the first to get here, but she got here way earlier. It shows that her next of kin that she put down was my great-uncle, Chin Pu, who was either going to school or working at Pudong University in Shanghai. So that kind of correlated to the stories that my family knew. And then, of course, this little detail of her being 5'4" really resonated with me. You always think of the older generations as being really tiny. And my grandmother was under 5 foot. My dad's only 5'6". And I'm 5'3". So her being 5'4", she must have been a giant of her generation. So here we see the missions interview when she landed. Never been married, never been to the United States. And then, of course, she signed it in her own handwriting. This is the first time we've seen anything of her own handwriting. And on the other side, it's just, typed up nicely, same information we've seen already, and then her intention of staying for 1 year and leaving in August of 1929. When her 1 year was almost up, she wrote to Immigrations and asked for an extension, which was granted. And then about a year later, she asked for another short extension so that she wouldn't overstay, because she wasn't really sure if she would leave right on time. Now, these 2 letters, as you can see, are in completely different handwriting. So at first I thought, well, maybe she just asked her classmates to write these letters for her. And then I remembered, if you see the right-hand signature, is exactly the same as the one that was in her interview when she landed. So this is a document written completely in her own handwriting, and it is the only one we have we don't have any in Chinese either, so this is it. And so it makes this really priceless for my family. So remember I said there was a postcard from Niagara Falls? Well, this is proof she was there. So shortly before she left the United States, she went to visit Niagara Falls. I don't know if I pointed out earlier, though, she actually went to school not in New York, she was in Philadelphia. So she went to Niagara Falls, and the only reason we have this is she's crossed over to Canada, and so there's this record. This is actually a Canadian record. So, yep, that postcard was real. So we don't know exactly what day she left America, but as you see, this letter on the left-hand side was a response to an inquiry by immigrations as to whether or not she actually left. So they said, yes, she did, and there's a forwarding address in Vienna. So at some point, maybe she went through Vienna. And on the right-hand side is another ship's manifest, which shows that she sailed from New York to London. So she landed in London. And that's where the trail goes cold. You know, I don't know where she went from Europe and how she got back to China, but someday I hope to go to Europe and find out. So she did get home, probably not long after, maybe a few months. She returned to work as a school doctor in Nankai schools. The story goes that she refused to work in private practice, lucrative private practice, and instead she opened a clinic for the poor and served a lot of the poor during the war. So this is actually a photo of the family again. It's grown a lot since the 20s. So this is around 1940. You see great-grandma in the middle there, and that's Aunt Grace. That's my grandpa and his brothers to both sides, and all of their children. So that's my dad. He was a real cutie. And the baby was delivered by Aunt Grace. Yeah. And he's the one that remembers seeing that postcard. So he lives down in California now. He's one of the younger ones. But he remembers seeing that postcard. So that kind of all ties it all together in a nice little bow. Okay, so not long after this photo was taken, Great Aunt Grace died of a massive stroke. She was only 45. During the funeral procession, a lot of her patients who were really grateful to her put on the mourning clothes that usually the children wear, you know, the sackcloth kind of thing. And they lined the funeral procession, and they acted as the children she never had. So she was really well-loved. Oops. Oh, no. There we go. So about 25 years later, in 1956, my dad's brother sailed from China, or Taiwan actually, to the United States to study, and followed by my dad in 1959. And guess where they went? You probably have guessed. They came to Seattle. They studied at the University of Washington. My uncle got a PhD in physics, and my dad got a PhD in electrical engineering. So thanks to Trish and the National Archives, I was able to pull together a book that I was able to share at the Chen family reunion last year. And you'll notice there's a lot of scribbles on it because after I shared it, people remembered more stories. So I'm going to have to do edition 2 soon. So it was a big hit. And that's my story. And now Trish will share some more stories from the file. I think we'll take questions afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.
So these are the Marr brothers of Seattle, George and James. They both have files, and their sister was Ruby Marr Chow, who had the Ruby Chow restaurant, and she was the first Asian American elected to Seattle King County Council in 1973. We don't have a file on Ruby because she didn't leave the country until after the law was repealed. This is Harry Chin. He was born in Seattle and went to local schools. He was a World War II vet who died in 1951 from complications of frostbite of both feet and pulmonary tuberculosis, which he developed when he was a prisoner of war in Germany. The photo is from his certificate of identity, which he obtained in 1942, just a few days after he enlisted in the U.S. Army. The reference sheet in his file contains the name and file numbers of his grandfather, his parents, 4 brothers, and 1 sister, and his wife. So that would be very valuable for his family. I don't know if any of them still live here, but if they do, they need to come to the National Archives. This is Luk Si. She was the wife of Chin Quong, who was a manager at the Quong Company in Seattle. And she made 2 trips to China, one in 1904 and another one in 1917. She first came to the United States about 1882, when she was about 13 years old. Her sister was married to Chin Ji-hee, who we talked about earlier. On the left is a collection of business cards that were found in one file. They're from Vancouver, BC, Seattle, Olympia, and Portland. And the man on the right is, he was a merchant in Spokane. And I just love his picture with his traditional clothes on. There are just so many beautiful pictures in the files, and I think that's what really keeps all of the volunteers working, because we see all these things. And these are some special pictures of families of the people that volunteer. The little boy on the left is Lily Eng's uncle from Yakima. Now, Lily is here someplace. There she is. And so Lily has done a lot of work on her family and has compiled a notebook full of information. So Lily is another one you can ask about what you can find in the files. The man on the right is the father of one of our other volunteers. And the volunteers are indexing these files. We have a basic index with the name of the person and the file number, but we're going through and we're adding more information. We're adding their other names, when they came into the country, their occupation, where they were born, their date of birth, things like that. So that'll make it easier for people to find these files. So one day, Rhonda was she was indexing the files, and she came across this picture of her father. So it was a really emotional day. And it just happened to be a couple days before Father's Day. So everything fell into place. This is an example of a marriage license from San Francisco. Not all of them are this fancy, but occasionally we see one like this. And this one was big. It was, like 15 inches wide and stuff. And in color. It was really beautiful. This is a picture of a traditional Chinese wedding. And the other one is of the Imperial Pekingese Troop. It was an 8x10 photo. it looks like everybody signed it. They were performing with the Pantages Theater Circuit. They played in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then they went to Canada, and this was in 1919. We also have a lot of files on acrobats and actors, people who came to perform in different World's Fairs. We have a lot of them that came for the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909. The problem with those files is they were travelers. They were just going to be here for 6 months to a year, so they didn't interview them, and they usually didn't take their pictures. The person, their employer, had to have a bond for each one, a $500 bond that he took out to assure that they would leave the country at the end of the 6 months or the year. So if the person just went into the, left and faded into the country, their employer would have lost the $50. So the picture of the acrobats is really unusual. Most of them don't have a picture. This is Mrs. Lum Sue. She lost her citizenship when she married a native Chinese. She was born in California, so she was a citizen of the United States. But eventually, the law was changed. The Cable Act of 1922 provided for women that had lost their American citizenship as a result of a marriage to a non-citizen. It could happen to other people besides the Chinese. If they married someone who wasn't a citizen, that would have happened too. And when the Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, a lot of these women went out and regained their citizenship, had to reapply. These are some of the booklets that we find in the files. The one on the left is for a graduation from Wilson Modern Business College in Seattle in 1922. So not only does it tell the person who the file is about, it has a list of everyone who graduated in that class. And the pamphlet on the right is The Story of Silk. It was a 16-page booklet by the American Chinese Silk Manufacturing Company. And the head office was in the Boston block in Seattle. The person who the file was on, he was being sent to China to secure a site for a silk factory and to promote his silk business, which seems kind of odd because he was going to China that's where most of the silk would be coming from. But this pamphlet had the officers, trustees, and a detailed business plan inside it. And it also had business cards for the company, and it had an undated article from the Seattle PI. And this is 30 years of this man's life. So he had 6 pictures taken. He left the country 6 times, and each time a picture was taken. So it shows him in the beginning with his traditional clothes and haircut, and all the way up to he has his American suit and haircut, and he's 30 years older. So there's a lot of information in between. And this is 3 generations. This is 7 separate files, but as you can see, I like to make collages. So we have Grandpa, his son, and then his 5 grandchildren. They were all living in Buffalo, New York, with the son's wife. The children were born in Buffalo, and they went to China. The wife stayed in China, and everybody else came back. And they went back to Buffalo, but eventually they moved to Texas. This is just some of the interesting things we see, just different fashion details. This little girl on the left, the picture was taken in 1912. She was the daughter of the Chinese consul in Vancouver, BC, and she was admitted to the Port of Seattle in 1912 with her mother, and they were making a brief trip from Vancouver to Seattle, and they were accompanied by Chin Quong of the Quan Tuc Company. The other family is the Charles William Singh family, and the picture was taken in 1889. I just really liked, I kind of like the woman's attitude. and just her neat hat. Everything about that picture is really neat. And this little girl is 10 months old, and you can see she has little fancy shoes, and her dress has lace on it. She was born in Portland, and they were visiting Vancouver, BC. So it didn't matter how old somebody was or where they were going. If they were leaving the United States, they had to fill out the forms, get a file. And they might even just be gone for a day or two. They still had to go through the whole thing. And this other family was from Portland. But it's a nice family portrait. This is an interpreter from Sumas, and he was going back to China, and this was in 1908. He applied to leave for 30 days annual leave and 220 days of leave without pay so that he could go back to China. And there's a phrase in his form that says, and thereafter return to his official duties as an interpreter. And I'm not quite sure if he had them put that in there to make sure that he got his job back, or if that was just standard verbiage. But it's the only time I've seen a photo of an interpreter with his uniform on, so that picture's pretty special. These are red marriage papers. The one on the left is the original, and the one on the right is for a different file, and it's a transcription. They each show 4 generations of the bride's family. So can you imagine finding that in your file? Pretty neat. This is, the one on the right is from a menu from the Far East Tea Garden in Wilmington, North Carolina. A merchant was taking his ill father back to China, and he wanted to show some proof that he owned this restaurant or was the manager of it. So he brought the menu along. So if someone came into the port of Seattle, even if they ended up in Wilmington, North Carolina, their file would be in Seattle. And the little girl on the left is one of our favorites. Her name is Little Dancy Wong. So her official name was Little Dancy. And ears were very important. When a child left, the thinking at the time was that a child's ears would would look the same as an adult. So they wanted to be sure that the ears were showing, so they could compare the picture of her if she came back as an adult. And we've seen this quite a bit in the files, and I haven't done any research to see if ears actually do stay the same. So if anyone knows that, please let me know. And that's all I have. So thank you. Any questions?
All right, so just to let you know, we are audio recording tonight, so we're going to ask that you speak into the microphone. Me and my colleague Stephen will be running around with mics, So please raise your hand, and we will come so that you can speak into the microphone. Other thing to know, you have to hold these very, very close to your mouth. So thank you. And with that said, we can now open the floor to Q&A.
I have a question for Cathy about her great aunt Grace. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was curious when you said that it was considered very scandalous that she wanted to practice medicine. But was it even more scandalous that she wanted to study Western medicine? Like if she'd stayed home and studied Eastern medicine, that also would have been taboo and considered strange. But it's even stranger that she would want to go study Western medicine. Or were there in fact lots of people practicing Western medicine in China at the time?
Well, I don't really know the history of that. I just know that for a girl from upper middle class family, usually wouldn't be doing something like medicine in any case. She should be embroidering or something.
I can add something to that. I'm not quite sure what years the Rockefeller Foundation covered, but I think it was in the 1930s. But they brought lots of people over from China to study medicine and engineering and things like that. They would go to college for a few years and then they'd go back to China. But they had men and women that came over.
My question's about the, I guess, the breadth of information available at the archive. It sounds like there's information from people all over the place. Have these people all gone through Seattle to get in this archive, or does stuff just land here from who knows where?
Well, the files that we have at the National Archives in Seattle are for people who came through the Port of Seattle or Portland or Sumas or Port Townsend.
What was that third one? Portland, Seattle, Portland, and
Sumas. It's in the U.S., but I'm not exactly sure. It's in east of Bellingham. Yeah, we don't have a lot. Most of those files are the really old files. We only have a few from Port Townsend. I don't know, 5 boxes or something like that.
We also have some from Helena.
Oh, and some from Helena. We have, I think, 105 boxes from Portland. So the rest of them are from Seattle. How many boxes is that, Lily?
Over 1,000.
Yeah, over 1,000. I think we're about maybe a little over half of indexing, the big index. Yeah.
So a quick question here. If we wanted to start the process of trying to learn about my father who entered the country, how would you even start? Would you have any suggestions for how to do that? He was a paper son.
Well, okay. Paper Sons is another, another lecture. But I think gather as much information as you have and talk to the people at the archives. I have some business cards over here that has the email and the telephone number of the archives. Maybe should we just start it going or something? We'll pass those out.
Just a reminder for questions, raise your hand really high so we can see you.
Just for clarification and to follow up on a question that was just asked. So if someone came to this country and they landed in Seattle, and then let's say they moved to Montana or New York or whatever, if they left the country, they would have to come back through Seattle? to go back to China?
They wouldn't necessarily have to come back through Seattle, but their file would be in Seattle because that's where they originally came in. They could leave from New York if they wanted to. But, yeah, they might have like a small file in New York that showed that they left, but their main file would be in Seattle. So it doesn't really matter where they ended up. So we actually, even though San Francisco has most of they have probably twice as many files as we have, we have a lot of files from people from San Francisco because they came into Seattle first.
So if you were researching, you would probably, if you knew, let's say they had moved to a different state, and then they went back to China, you would probably have to contact both centers, where they would have done these questions and taken photos.
Well, their information would probably end up in Seattle. If they came into Seattle the first time, I would check Seattle first. Yeah. Yes.
I'm coming, I see you.
Thank you. So my father was came here in the 20s. I have no idea if he ever came to Seattle. How would I find his files? He was in California, he was in Illinois, and he was in Hawaii.
Well, I would gather all the information you have, where he was, what years, his name, anything you know about him, his date of birth, and I would contact the archivists at the National Archives in Seattle. I'd start just because it would be easier, because you're here, and they would look for him in the files, and if he wasn't there, they could give you advice about where to look next. Lily, is that anything to add?
Was he just a student, or did he immigrate here?
Hi, Lily.
Hi.
He was a student. He went back, after he graduated, he went back to China, and then he eventually immigrated here in the 50s.
Well, I was lucky with my father. He had his certificate of identity, and then when he applied for citizenship, on his application, he gave information about when the ship he arrived on, and dates, and so I was able to find his records fairly easily, but I would start with whatever kind of records you have about when the person arrived at the U.S.
Hi, I understand very vaguely that when the Chinese Exclusion Act was implemented, that a lot of Chinese were forced to leave Seattle. So are there records for that?
Not in the Exclusion Act. That was actually before the Exclusion Act went into effect. And there aren't a lot of records early on. So it went into effect 1882, but we really don't have very many records until about in the 1890s. But if the person was forced to leave wherever they went, if they ever went back to China after the act went into effect, there might be a file on him. But not for that time period of when they were forced to leave Seattle.
Any other questions?
So do all the files stop when the act was repealed?
No. They can keep going, especially if if someone wanted to become a citizen or bring someone else in, there are things in the file after it was repealed, but there wouldn't be any new files.
I have a question. Can I ask a question? So I'm a member of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and we just worked to pass the Congressional Gold Medal for Chinese American World War II vets. So now what we're trying to do with Richard there is look for the World War II vets, the Chinese American World War II vets during, before the war was over, in order to get them their gold medals. And so we thought, is it possible to get a list or something from the archives for something like that? And can you help?
Well, we have a column called miscellaneous information, and we like to put in things like that, but we are limited about everything that we can put in there. And since with the dates, we don't always know if, even if they had a file and they were a veteran, that might not be in their file. So it's kind of by chance that we find those things. But there are other ways to find. I would look on Ancestry and find for the World War II vets, and look for the Chinese, and then go back and see if there's a file. So, okay.
I'd like to make a correction. The Chinese expulsion was in 1886. A few years ago, I was in charge of a rally and march and speaker series that marked 125 years that the Chinese were driven out of Seattle. One of the research resources is right in this building. MoHi has a tremendous store of newspaper articles of when they were trying to first expel the Chinese, and they, Judge Thomas moved in, and they declared martial law. And so very, very much valuable research right here in this building.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, actually, they're not here. We do have some in our exhibit, but if you're interested in seeing more of the newspaper files and other resources like that, they're in our library in Georgetown. And if you go online to our website, you can make an appointment with the librarian, tell them what you're interested in looking at, and come look at our files. So. Lots of cool places, both the National Archives and us, and shout out to the Seattle room, which one of our partners, they have a whole historical room too. So if you're looking to do research into any of this, lots of good places around the city.
And I guess I want to add something to that. Even though it happened after, in 1886, we in Seattle, we don't have any files. Our files start after 1886. But that doesn't mean there isn't a file for someone who was expelled from Seattle. They might have left the country later, and they might have come back to Seattle and then left later. So there might be a file on one of those people.
Thank you for sharing this information, this part of history. It helps us give us a little context of where we are today as far as immigration and laws that were racist. And I'm wondering, a lot of the interrogation documents that you shared, did all immigrants have to do that process? Or was this just exclusive then for that law?
No, this
and any other reflections on that type of racist policies and that you might want to share?
This was for the Chinese. Yeah, it was the first law that would prevent a certain group of people from entering the country. Now, we see a lot of similarities between the files and what's happening now. And that's why it's important for people to know about these files, to know that it happened before.
So this is maybe a clarification, as you know, maybe the oh well does kind of come to my mind, but it sounds to me like any Chinese that came to America between 1882 and 1843, and possibly up in 1943, and possibly up through 1965 or so, has a file at some port of entry. Is that a fairly safe generalization? I mean, I'm sure people slip through and stuff.
No, not necessarily. If they were in the United States before 1880, they could leave and come back, and if they left, they would have to have a file. But if they were under the radar, they might not. And they wouldn't have a file from 1943 to 1965. That was the quota, but they wouldn't have a file. They wouldn't have an exclusion file, but they might have additional information in their file that was started before 1943. It's kind of confusing.
And well, J. Edgar was around during some of those years, so they probably had files because of that.
I wanted to respond to Cathy's request for information about veterans, military veterans, the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration has records about veterans and where their benefits go and where they live, so you should be able to find them through the VA.
This isn't just about people getting access to their family
Can't hear you.
history, but what about, is this being taught in the schools, like in the Seattle history classes?
Well, I don't know about Seattle history classes, but there are some educational programs that the Wing Luke has an education program that they're trying to train teachers about it.
So CACA has been fighting to get this to be on the curriculum statewide, and it is not yet. Betty Luke in the back has more information if you want to ask her afterwards.
If someone were interested to volunteer to help index, who would they contact?
Well, come see me. No, did you get one of those cards, business cards that just write to them right now? We have 5 people working on the index, and we're only a little more than 50% finished. I mean, it's not going to be finished in my lifetime unless we get lots more volunteers. So we would love to have as many volunteers as possible. And it's fun. It's I mean, you see all those beautiful pictures, and we have a good group. We have fun. We share the good stories. I mean, usually we find 1 or 2 interesting files every week. So, and we all share the pictures and stuff. So it is lots of fun.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
It's not a question. Is this doing? Okay. I just wanted to add that if you've never been to the archives, it's right across the street from Magnuson. And it's very interesting because the Magnuson Act of 1943 was the one that did away with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in 1965, Magnuson himself, when he was a senator, helped to lobby to repeal his own act, because his own act restricted Chinese to only 105 per year. But that was the only way he can get it through as a congressman in 1943. So he actually campaigned to get rid of his own act. That's our own United States Senator Warren G. Mickelson.
Thank you. And thank you so much to Trish and Cathy for everything you've shared tonight. Another round of applause.